Mark 4:11, for example, Jesus is attributed to have said to his disciples, "Unto you is given to know the mystery of the kingdom of God, but unto them that are without, all these things are done in parable." There are, in fact, at least 27 references in the New Testament to this secret layer of teaching. The Greek used here, that becomes translated in the King James Version as mystery, is mysterion, which means mysteries. Mysterion can be understood as, among other things, a hidden thing or a religious secret confided only to the initiated and not to ordinary mortals. Mysterion comes from mueo, which means to initiate into the mysteries, hence to instruct. This word is used in only one occasion in the New Testament, and it is by Paul in his letter to the Philippians at 4:12, where he states that he has been initiated. This was part of his own claim to authority over the church that he established. In his work Contra Celsus, at 359, Origen quotes Celsus, describing Christianity as one of the mysteries, Talatai. In his work The Passing of Peregrinus, the Roman satirist Lucian of Samosata calls Christianity a new cult, Canon Teletan, which means that he also considered it a type of mystery religion. Furthermore, Origen himself wrote extensively about the existence of a mystery element to Christianity. Apart from its use in the New Testament, the concept of a mystery element also had a strong precedent in Judaism. In a fragment entitled About Initiation into Divine Mysteries, Philo states, "It is unlawful to speak of the sacred mysteries to the uninitiated." The Greek term mysterion appears in the Septuagint at, for example, the 2nd chapter of the book of Daniel in relation to the prophets interpreting the dream of King Nebuchadnezzar. The king answered unto Daniel and said, "Of a truth it is, that your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal this secret." That's at 247. This narrative, coincidentally enough, mentions the kingdom of God. "And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom," and that's at 244. As illustrated above in the quote from Mark at 4:11, God's kingdom was, by all accounts, a favorite theme of Jesus, and it is very often tied into this element of mystery in both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. It is commonly accepted in New Testament studies that because he is attributed to have taught poor people, Jesus was also poor and therefore uneducated. It is further believed that Jesus would have had a limited, if any, knowledge of Greek. We have been dealing with the point of Jesus' general education level, and now we need to lay to rest this unfounded bias that Jesus would not have been versed in the Greek language. The first thing to mention here is that Jesus is attributed to have taught non-Jewish, non-Aramaic speaking people in all 4 of the canonical Gospels. This is a vital piece, perhaps the single most important piece in our picture puzzle of Jesus, and it is a point that has not been paid anywhere near the attention that it deserves in the scholarly debates. These inclusive narratives have created a problem in varying degrees for the Gospel authors because, as mentioned above, the standard theology in the later writings was that Jesus was sent first to the Jews. We can argue, therefore, that these narratives probably stem from early traditions of Jesus and that they have been perhaps reluctantly included into the larger contexts of the later narratives. The exorcism of the Syro-Phoenician woman's daughter is a good example for us to consider. It is recounted at Mark 7:24-30. At verses 27-28, there is a hint that Jesus is making an exception to minister to her. "First let the children eat all they want," he told her, "for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." "Lord," she replied, "even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Despite this qualification, the story was probably too overtly Gentile-friendly for Luke, who omitted it. It is included in Matthew at 15:21-28, but the situation is more clearly explained at 15:24, where Matthew has Jesus declare, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." So we can see that Mark's subtle allusion to the primacy of the Jews for Jesus is developed fully and clearly by Matthew. This is but a tiny example of how the dogma that Jesus was sent first to the Jews developed over time, and that this development is displayed in the chronology of the Gospels. Rather than going forward to further demonstrate this point, we will go backwards to Q and see that Jewish primacy is not only absent, it runs counter to the general narrative. The healing of the centurion's servant is a Q story appearing at Luke 7, 1-10 and in Matthew at 8, 5-13. In both accounts, the centurion tells Jesus that he is not worthy for him to come under his roof. This turns the healing into a long-distance event where Jesus merely has to say the word and the servant will be healed. In Luke, the cultural distance between Jesus and the Roman is exaggerated to the point where Jesus does not speak directly to the centurion, who sends intermediaries to speak for him. This distancing betrays itself as Luke's personal gloss because it makes the narrative clumsy. There is nonetheless no mention in Luke's version of Jesus being sent primarily to the Jews. It is fair to say that if we take Matthew's smoother version as the original story, the rapport between Jesus and the centurion was so close that there were no significant language barriers between them. This same point is also made at Mark 7, 24-30, where it is specifically stated that the Syro-Phoenician woman is speaking Greek. The unavoidable conclusion we must make here is that according to the tale, Jesus was also speaking Greek. It is commonly accepted that Jesus lived in Nazareth. The main evidence for this is that placing the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem was a problem that Matthew and Luke solved in conflicting ways. Not only do their contradictory stories testify to their fictional content, but also to the point that it must have been well known in the original tradition of Jesus that he lived in Nazareth. Nazareth was a small town of 300 to 400 people, but it was a satellite town of Sepphoris, which was a major metropolitan center and a mere 6 kilometers, less than 4 miles from Nazareth. This would have been about an hour's walk. The city was visible from Nazareth, and Jesus must have had at the very least an acquaintance with it. Therefore, it will serve us to briefly examine its role in the first century. Sepphoris had a colorful and highly significant history. According to Josephus, after Herod the Great's death in 4 BCE, a rebel named Judas, son of a local bandit Ezekias, captured the city, which was then the administrative center of the Galilee. He raided its treasury and stole weapons with which to arm his followers in a revolt against pro-Hellenistic Herodian rule. The town was subsequently sacked by the Romans. When Herod's son, Herod Antipas, was made tetrarch or governor of the Galilee, he rebuilt Sepphoris as the ornament of the Galilee and used it as his home city until the completion of Tiberias on the western shore of the Sea or Lake of Galilee, and that's in Antiquities 1827. In 66 CE, when the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem had decided to take action against Roman rule, Josephus was sent north to recruit the Galilee into the rebellion's fold. He was only partially successful and made 2 attempts to capture Sepphoris but failed to conquer it. The first time because of the city's own resistance, the second because of the assistance of a Roman garrison. And that's in Josephus' Wars at 2-5-11, 3:30-34, and 59-62. The important point in this history is that for the majority of Palestinian Jews, the influence was embraced for the benefits it brought, and there was no popular alignment with the war council in Jerusalem. In his autobiographical work Life, Josephus states that the inhabitants of Sepphoris went out to greet Vespasian, and that's at paragraph 411. In the aftermath of the war, Galilee fared much better than Jerusalem, and it is clear that the revolt was mostly centered in the capital. The decisive victory of the Roman army was the sacking of the temple in the city. Recent archaeological finds have unearthed a great deal of evidence which is commonly accepted to testify to the cosmopolitan nature of the Galilee in general and Sepphoris in particular. As evidenced in the New Testament, the use of Greek personal names was common, as was the use of Greek for place names. There are Greek influences evident in the commerce, which is in signs and coins, in the art and architecture of the region. I do not think we need to labor this point further. Greek was the lingua franca of the region, and it is untenable to think that the common people, who would have been trading widely with as many as possible, would have limited their markets by only speaking Aramaic. This bias that Jesus, or his attributed peasant following for that matter, were not well versed in the dominant language of trade is an anomaly that betrays the mindset not of a first century Jew, but an English-speaking modern person. The majority of English-speaking lands are islands or semi-continents with few or no immediate foreign-speaking neighbors. Also, English is the lingua franca of the world, so there is no real pressure for people to learn other languages. In continental Europe, where countries generally have several foreign-speaking neighbors directly at their borders, it is normal for people to have 2 or 3 languages. This is not just those who are urban or highly educated, but to a greater or lesser degree it extends throughout the actual cultures. An extension of this phenomenon is that it is very common for countries to develop different dialects, which are a result of the linguistic overlaps at their borders. In Germany, for example, which has several dialects, the German language changes to accommodate that of its neighbors. In the northern and northwestern areas of the country, for example, many of the complex grammatical nuances are more simplified than the other dialects, and many new words from English and Scandinavian languages have been adopted into the Plattdeutsch dialect. This situation has a very long history and attests to the fluid nature of language in general, as well as the overlaps that German people have had with neighboring countries through trade, wars, and other cross-cultural contact. It is not only reasonable to assume that such a situation of near universal cross-cultural overlap would have been prevalent in first century Palestine, it is decidedly unreasonable to assume that it wasn't. Having laid this point to rest, it is clear that the good connection between Jesus and the centurion is deeper than mere language. The story records what would have been understood as overt references to pagan magical procedures. The centurion's request that Jesus merely had to say the word to activate the healing, for example, agrees with the mechanisms explained in various ancient magical texts, where a strong emphasis is placed on the magical efficacy of words which contain power in and of themselves. This magical concept was also part of the broader Hebrew religious tradition, and the names of God were, predictably enough, among those considered to be especially potent. At Matthew 26:53, Jesus states that he would only need to say the word and his Father would send him 12 legions of angels. The Roman army was considered the most religious of the day, and they had a high profile in first century Palestine. One Latin word which describes something approaching angels was numen. This word meant chthonic or underworld deities, and also came to mean the spirit of an individual, as in the example of the first century Roman imperial cult, which began by people venerating the genius or numen of Augustus. This shows the distinction between the numen and the person became blurred. The energy of these nature spirits was believed to be imparted to those who paid tribute to them. In the Roman cult, the numen were objectified in the standards such as the eagles that belonged to each legion. These totems represented special animals, and it was their spirit which would be shared with those who honored their power. Camp walls were adorned with protection statues, and there were also specific sacred parade ground deities. A major part of the dialogue in the centurion story is given to the centurion's statement, "I am also in a chain of command, with Roman soldiers under me. I tell one go, and they go. I tell another come, and they come. I tell my servant do this, and they do it." This directive, given by the centurion himself, attests to a very close rapport between the Roman and Jesus that ignored any cultural religious difference. The magical basis behind this long-distance healing narrative is the centurion's faith that Jesus had the ability to marshal celestial agents, the genii, as deputies in the healing. In this story, Jesus commends the centurion's faith and states that it is beyond that of his Jewish followers. This is a Q story, which we can assume is independent from Mark. The same theme of his followers' confusion at who Jesus was, however, is one that is also evident in Mark's Gospel. At Mark 8:29, Peter is attributed to have called Jesus the Messiah. This reference is an anomaly in the larger narrative, however, because at Mark 4:41, 6:51-52, and 8:15-21, It is explained in detail that Jesus' disciples have no idea who he is. The latter two examples are tied directly to the multiplication of food miracles, the meaning of which the disciples also had not understood. In Mark, the knowledge of Jesus' identity is most clearly stated by authorial inference or various demons in presage to their being exorcised, for example at Mark 1:24 and Mark 3:11. We should also remember that the loaves and fishes episode is explaining the further miracle of Jews and Gentiles sitting down and eating together en masse, without the burden of the observance of food purity laws. These nuances in the earlier writings testify to the probable historical reality that Jesus was at least as successful, if not more so, outside the Jewish milieu in his teachings. A further illustration of this is Jesus' cue teaching for his disciples to eat whatever is given you. The import of this statement is elaborated with the complement that I have added from Matthew 15:11 to my own rendition of Q. Because it is not that which goes into your mouth that defiles you, only that which comes from your mouth defiles you. We can confidently argue here that these wise words were part of the original Q narrative, and again, these were edited out of the text by Luke to comply with the emphasis that the Jerusalem church had to continue with Jewish purity laws in general, as described in the book of Acts, for example at Acts 10:27-29 or Acts 15:24-29. Jesus' ability to speak Greek or some form of mixture dialect, widely understandable to the people of the region, and his radical cross-cultural focus is not only obvious in the earliest writings, but, as I have mentioned, it is a vital subject that has escaped the attention of the majority of scholarship surrounding the historical Jesus. We have seen that it is almost certain that Jesus was highly educated in, for want of a better term, depth psychology, and also that he very likely spoke and read Greek. More direct literary evidence of these points will be presented below. Let us now return to the point that we are made in the image or archetype of God. I will add a qualification here that although the theory of the archetypes is treated still today as a philosophical and metaphysical idea, the vast majority of literature on the subject for the last 100 years is in the realm of depth psychology. The concept of the imago Dei, or God image, is explained in Philo's treatise on the creation, where he describes it as emanating from the archetypal model, the idea of ideas, the reason of God, and that's at 625. Philo continues by expanding on the meaning of the first creation event in Genesis. The biblical account states that people are made in the image or icon of God. And Philo goes on, and if the image be part of the image, then so manifestly is the entire form. That's at 625. This means that the whole of creation itself is, and I quote Philo here, a most perfect impression of a most perfect model. This exact same universalist perspective is echoed by Paul at Romans 8:18-21. For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. For the earnest expectation of the creature waiteth for the manifestation of the sons of God. For the creature was made subject to vanity, not willingly, but by reason of him who hath subjected the same, in hope, because the creature itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. It is worth noting here that these particular statements from Philo and Paul, and the general concept of the archetypes itself, do not support the later Christian dogma of the fall. Philo agrees with the point, expressed at John 10:34, quoting Psalms 82:6, that we are Elohim. In Jesus' teaching, with a little help from Paul, we get to the radical method of realizing this potential. As stated in the Psalms extract and the complete narrative at John 10, our divine potential is dependent upon us becoming children of God. It follows automatically from this that we are no longer children of our earthly parents. One can serve only one master. This directive is important enough if our families or our culture's expectation is for us to follow the route to material prosperity above an alignment with God's will and the installation of God's kingdom. But there is more to it than that. Apart from in Mark's passion narrative, There are two other places in the New Testament where the Aramaic word Abba is used. Both are by Paul, and both agree totally with the sentiment expressed by Mark's Jesus at the cross. The first of the Pauline uses we will look at presages the Romans extract quoted above. This is at Romans 8:14-17. For those who are led by the Spirit of God are the children of God. The Spirit you received does not make you slaves, so that you live in fear again. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship, and by him we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit we received here is an important dimension to the fuller context. Further on in this profound narrative, Paul states that we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now, and not only they, but ourselves also, which have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting for the adoption, to wit, the redemption of our body. The Greek translated in the King James here as travaileth is synodinu. This word is often translated in English as in childbirth, which is perhaps a bit more specific than the original word, but it is a beautiful poetic complement to Paul's meaning. In English, we might say of a pregnant woman that she is expecting, and this is the vital import that Paul is aiming at. We have been given a spirit that expects to be connected to God via the divine imago or archetype. This is the defaulted archetypal drive in us, which produces the psychological and emotional cathexis to the caregivers in our life. The second of Paul's uses of Abba is at Galatians 4:6. Included here is the fuller context, starting at the beginning of the chapter. Now I say that the heir, as long as he is a child, differeth nothing from a servant, though he be Lord of all, but is under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the Father. Even so we, when we are children, were in bondage under the elements of the world. But when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. Because you are his sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. This is an incredibly astute summation of the development of our instinctual drives as discussed in the previous chapter. In this particular narrative, Paul is universalizing the development of our attachment instinct to be transferred from our society onto God in terms of a general cultural evolution. This same measure is as relevant today as it was in the first century milieu in which Paul was living. This is because, like the Jewish culture of the first century, we are watching the end of an age where the wineskin of the old belief systems needs to be exchanged so that we can be effective bottles of the new wine. At 1 Corinthians 13, 9-12, Paul gives a more personal explanation of the process. This passage starts with the statement, Though I speak with the tongues of men and angels, if I have no love, I am but a clanging gong or a resounding cymbal. And that's my translation. After this introduction, Paul continues with explaining what love is, and juxtaposes this in typical Socratic fashion with what love is not. He concludes at verse 9 following, For now we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. When I was a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as I am known. And now abideth faith, hope, love, these three, but the greatest of these is love. The Greek word here for perfect is one which is regularly encountered in the New Testament in reference to the end goal of the repentance or transformation process. The word in Greek is teleon, which was also used for the adepts of the Hellenistic mystery religions who had gained their mystic vision. With the statement, when that which is perfect is come, Paul is meaning the divine archetype of the kingdom of God being realized here on earth in our lives. Various forms of the same word were used for initiates and the process itself of initiation. The related word telete meant a mystery cult. we can see here that with the root tele, the term is indicating something being moved a great distance. So the Greek word that appears almost universally in the English Bible translations as perfect means to be otherworldly. It implies the individual taking a mystic movement towards a far-removed goal. In the classical context, including for the readers of the original New Testament texts, all of this was commonly understood as part of the import of the language itself. In modern translations, this mystery dimension is completely lost. It is significant that Paul, in the extract quoted above, uses the phrase seeing through a glass darkly. This same phrase was used by Plato in his Phaedo dialogue in relation to people not seeing the real of the archetypal realms. This is an important stepping stone in the development of Paul's mystic theology here. In 2 Corinthians, Paul developed this thing. At 3:18 he states, "But we all, with open face, beholding as in the glass, the glory of God, are changed into the same image," and we've got icon here, archetype, "from glory to glory, even as by the Spirit of the Lord." The first thing to notice here is the reference to looking in the glass. This time, however, we are not looking darkly. This is because we have an open face and are beholding the glory of God. We have to emphasize the word beholding here, which is eidon, because there is a hidden or occult image that was steeped in power in Hellenistic mystery religions. In the Eleusinian mystery religion, for example, the initiates are called epopte, which means a viewer, and the word is a synonym for beholder. The yearly festival for the greater mysteries lasted 9 days and was wrapped around the myth of the goddess Demeter, whose daughter Persephone was taken into the underworld by Hades. Throughout the festival, the participants reenact the story of Demeter's journey to find her daughter in a mystery play. They behold sacred objects, share in her tribulation, including fasting and mourning, as well as her immortal triumph. By doing this, their beholding is not only a visionary exercise, but also means that they actually partake in the fate of the goddess herself. The 6th night was the most sacred time of the whole festival. It was the scene of the beholding. The mystae, or novices, were admitted into the presence of the epopte, who were said to have had a mystic vision into the other world. The trance state mechanics of emotional catharsis is institutionalized into the dynamics of these sacred rites. This is not uncommon, and the same could be said for many forms of tribal religiosity, such as the modus operandi of the shaman and their healing practices, which revolve around altered states for both the shaman and the patient. The accusations of Jesus being possessed by Beelzebul and the narrative surrounding John the Baptist's own possession by demons appear in both Q and Mark. This is a strong attestation to their authenticity. As explained above, episodes of catharsis may appear to the outsider to be some form of demon possession. A further point needs to be made here about the style of baptism associated with John in the New Testament accounts. According to Matthew at 3:6, following Mark at 1:4, John baptized people in the Jordan River. Instead, Luke writes merely he went into all the country around the Jordan River. The detail of baptizing in the river is noticeably absent in Luke, although John is still located in the region. An aside can be made here. In Luke's description of the region where John ministered, I emphasize the words all and around. They are pantas and pericorum in the extract, because most of the surrounding area, especially to the north and east, would have been solely Gentile lands. It appears Luke is probably unwittingly giving further evidence that the movement was not solely focused on the Jewish people, and that this was the case right from the outset, even before the baptism of Jesus. This same wide-scale inclusive focus is repeated in the Legion story, which Luke faithfully reproduces. At Mark 5:1, Jesus arrives at the other, or eastern, side of the Sea of Galilee at Gerasenes. Again, this was an exclusively Gentile region, and it is not only the demoniac himself, but also large crowds of Gentiles who were touched by the wonder-working power of Jesus in Legion's visit to the neighboring town, where he tells the story. While Luke still affirms John's role as a well-supported Baptist, and also the baptism of Jesus by John, it is interesting to ask the question as to why it is that he did not specifically mention that John baptized in the Jordan River. According to both Josephus and Philo, it was not at all the custom of first century Jewish people to take ritual baths in rivers. For these people, this would have been anathema. At Jewish War, at 2:8-121 to 161, and Decalogue 11:44, Josephus and Philo respectively state that the custom was to take a bath with water that had been specifically purified to meet purity requirements. At Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, examples of such baths have been excavated. There is a complex system of troughs through which the water passed on the way to these baths, which presumably was part of the purification process. Apart from this, many other examples of Jewish ritual baths have been unearthed in the region from the period. The popularist modern arguments, which appeared at the start of the proliferation of the new religious movements at the end of the 19th century, that tried to assert that Jesus and John may have been Essenes, is untenable in the light of this aspect of Jewish custom. It is highly unlikely that Jesus and John were Essenes, given their complete disregard for ritual bathing purity that we know to have been an integral part of Essene religious practice. Furthermore, we must also question exactly how tied to the general first century Jewish purity dogma the pair really were. As it happens, there is a strong precedent for the river baptism described of John in the Hellenistic mystery religions, where the neophytes and more advanced participants are well known to have performed ritual baptisms in the sea and also in rivers. This further correlation to the Hellenistic mysteries brings our argument a step closer to the more specific meaning of Jesus' exhortation to become a child of God in order to receive the kingdom of God in our hearts. According to the Orphic gold tablets found at Sybaris, the outcome of the mysteries was essentially regarded as an adoption of the person by the goddess of God, and the initiated was received into the divine family. Sometimes the person is also called born again, renatos, or eternally reborn. In the mysteries, this concept emphasized the aspect of the initiation as being a holy birthday or a day of birth. The adopted is assumed to be reborn from the womb of his new divine mother. The ritual sponsor, who had already received admittance into the divine tribe, was called the pater or mystic father, and they guided the entrance of the new member into the circle. All of these images were adopted into the Greek texts that make up the New Testament. These concepts are dependent upon the same Hellenized theology evident in and explained at length by Paul and Philo. We have learnt that Jesus had intimate contact with and knowledge of the Hellenistic culture of his time. It is also evident that both Jesus and his mentor John did not strictly conform to traditional Jewish religious culture. Given all these points, it is reasonable to argue that these teachings, heavily dependent on the Hellenistic mysteries, were part of Jesus' authentic teaching and healing practices. The final conclusion of the sword analogy is that we should cut the psychic cathexis to our parents and direct that emotional psychic drive not outwards onto others in our lives, which is what generally happens to people, but inwards to our own innate image of a divine child. This is the result of the imago Dei active in us. In other words, the instinctual impulse is absorbed into our own archetypal identity as Elohim, or children of God. This is when the kingdom of God comes to earth for us, that is, in our conscious realization and lives, and it reflects its reality as it is in heaven, i.e. in the archetypal realm. The work in receiving God's kingdom in our heart is not only in the healing of our early pain, but also the engagement with social conditioning. It has been demonstrated in neurology that the effect of our early influences forms the actual material structure of our brains. Rather than having an unconscious hard drive like domestic computers which is not altered by new downloads, our brains are upgraded by and will follow the direction of any new information like a sophisticated learning computer. This dynamic is demonstrated in the example of elephants who, as infants, are tied with a small rope which can hold them as babies. The fact that as adults with much greater strength this same rope will still hold them is because the elephant's neurons have been hardwired forever to think that the rope is strong enough to hold them. We need to address the ropes in our own hardwiring that make us follow unskillful cultural programming.